In Ancient Dungeon VR, there are many items and relics available for use that are made to aid the player in their ultimate goal of escaping the dungeon, or going back into the dungeon for a more difficult run. However, nothing are quite like the 17 marks available in the game. These marks stay with the player on an active ability basis, meaning you can press a button and their effect will take place. These abilities are locked behind cooldowns that vary by the power of each mark. So when going through your dungeon delve, how do you know which marks are good and which ones are better than others? If you encounter 2 random marks, which one's better? Today I seek to answer that question by listing off in order the marks from worst to best in Ancient Dungeon VR. These marks were graded with regard to their early game uses, for their late game and deep new game plus runs, and for their secondary effects. Many of these secondary effects are not super substantial, but they do provide tiebreakers for some of those marks with very similar effects. Without further ado, let's get started at the bottom of the list, number 17. Rounding off the bottom of our list is the Anarchist's brand. The Anarchist brand describes that for a cost used to cause an explosion. This cost is actually your gold count, and it takes a decent amount of gold per explosion. However, this leads to the best upside of this item in the fact that it has no cooldown and can be spammed in a pinch, unlike every other mark in the game. However, draining your gold is not a good trait to have, and it provides no secondary effect, meaning you use this item to only drain your gold to deal an explosion. The explosion effect is a good effect and belongs to very similar items much higher up on this list, but draining your gold instead of being on the short cooldown that similar items offer is not a good trade-off, and you would be better served by another mark. Rounding off the end of F tier is number 16, the Merchant's Mark. The Merchant's Mark describes that once charged, you can use it to convert nearby upgrade items into gold. While maybe a good sounding effect on paper, it has a couple of issues. Firstly, this only works on relics, so you cannot turn orbs or food when your health is full or your inventory is full into gold to make the items more useful to you. Additionally, the whole purpose of gold is to get more upgrade items, so using it to delete an upgrade item for a very small amount of gold is typically not a good trade-off. With that being said, you can convert very bad relics into gold, which is sometimes helpful, but there are other marks on this list that actually do this better, and its secondary effect of a 10% discount is not very large in the grand scheme of things. Leading off C tier at our number 15 spot is the Ascetic's Mark. The Ascetic's Mark is used when charged to improve a random characteristic, with a secondary effect that being low on health increases damage. For future reference in this video, when an item or a mark describes being low on health, that means being at 1 heart or less. The Ascetic's Mark finds itself down here at the bottom for being too weak and too slow. Improving a random characteristic is a great effect, but improving it at one stage every 25 kills if you remember to use it upon every refresh is much too little, far too slow. If this item were to be on a little bit lower of a recharge or provide a larger buff at a higher recharge, this mark would be quite good, and the damage increase at being low on health is actually very helpful even late game when hearts are no longer in the picture. All in all, the Ascetic's Mark is just a little tweaking away from being much higher up on this list, but it finds itself within the C tier of marks that are either too slow or their effects are just not useful in the long run. At number 14, still in C tier, maybe a surprising mark to some players, but it is the Healer's Mark. The Healer's Mark has the effect of, when charged, used to gain half a heart of health, which is equivalent to 1 hit in an initial run. It has a secondary effect with its Marvelous Marks effect that food has a chance to heal an extra half a heart. This item has a decent recharge rate at 20 kills, and its effect is consistent and good in early game. However, this mark falls off very quickly. In your first New Game Plus run, you'll realize that damage is doubled. meaning it will require 2 charges and uses to heal a hit instead of just 1. The extra chance to heal a heart with food is a nice buff, while you still actually have food to consume, and again, in later runs, food's chance of spawning decreases. The Healer's Mark is very good and solid for newer players on their first run, trying to get to the final area of the dungeon for the first time. However, the Healer's Mark falls off very quickly, and finds itself below other marks that don't fall off quite as quickly and have useful effects even into New Game Plus or higher runs. It also finds itself below marks that are more useful even in the initial run. Being able to heal is a good effect, but if you play a little bit better and take less damage, this mark is actually a little less useful to you. In the upper half of C tier, at number 13, is the Gambler's Mark, my personal favorite mark of the game that I really wish was a little bit better. The Gambler's Mark has the effect of, when charged, used to either gain some health, being 1 full heart, or lose a lesser amount, in half a heart. The key thing to note about this is as damage increases later down the line, this risk effect actually does not increase and remains at half a heart, meaning if you gamble, you actually don't lose a full hit's worth of HP while gaining a full hit's worth of HP in later areas of the run, which what makes it superior to the Healer's Mark, given that it has an equal cooldown. The Gambler Mark's second effect is a flat passive 35 increase to luck. This allows for the Gambler's Mark to actually be a more consistent healing option than the Healer's Mark in some circumstances. At our number 12 spot and the top of C tier is the Penitent Mark. Other than being the hardest mark to say, it also has the effect of, when charged, used to gain a random relic but lose a small amount of health. Gaining a random relic is an incredible effect and is shared by a mark higher on this list, but losing an amount of health with it causes a big issue. When you get to New Game Plus 3, any amount of damage is lethal, and this causes you to immediately lose, making this mark effectively useless. Even in the early game, paying health for a relic is shared by a relic called the Pack Rat Mandible. The Pack Rat Mandible actually increases your damage significantly, but at the cost of every time you fetch a relic you take damage. The Penitent Mark works a similar way. You use the effect to gain a random relic, but you lose health in the process in addition to the cooldown, making this very effective for ramping power quickly if you have the health pool to work with. If you don't have the health pool to work with, this mark is almost useless to you, and you would be better served by something else. Its Marvelous Mark's secondary effect gives a 10% evasion boost, which is actually quite nice, and for late game runs means you're not just stuck with it. It is actually still helping to do something for you. However, the marks above this spot on the list are actually quite good, and I'm excited to share them with you. At the bottom of B tier in spot number 11 is the Miner's Mark. The Miner's Mark states that when charged, you can use to emit a line of damaging spikes. There is an item called the Pickaxe Head. It is a relic that does a very similar thing, but when you use a melee weapon strike on the ground. The damaging spike line is actually quite good and does a good amount of damage to your ground-based enemies and can even hit lower altitude flying enemies. Its second effect, from the Marvelous Marks part of the skill tree, makes that glittering orbs have a higher chance of spawning, almost twice the chance per the description. Glittering orbs are an awesome thing to find, but they are very rare. They help your ability to gain gold and relics to a degree that no other orb really can, and it is a nice secondary effect. Using this mark, I've actually found a couple more glittering orbs than usual, so it is quite noticeable. However, that's about all this does, and it is a damage mark that you have to aim. Most of the damage marks are higher on this list for the fact that you have to aim them a bit less, and they do quite a bit more damage than what the Miner's Mark can unleash. However, credit to the Miner's Mark, it is a low cooldown mark that allows you to find better items, potentially if you're lucky enough to find a glittering orb. All in all, a very balanced option to start off our B tier rankings. Breaking into the top 10 is the Messenger's Mark, which has the description of once charged, used to dash, with a secondary effect of a 30% movement speed bonus. This mark has the lowest cooldown rate in the entire game of marks with a cooldown at 1 kill. The dash is somewhat useful in certain circumstances. You can use the dash to go over certain areas of the void or pits, assuming the area you're standing on is at a higher altitude than the area you want to finish on. I'm currently trying to test to see if this mark can be used to skip the lock-in rooms where it forces you to fight, and if you can, I think it may actually move up a spot on this tier list for nothing but raw utility. The movement speed bonus is a nice quality of life change if you want to backtrack and grab something, and can have small implications in helping you to dodge certain attacks or avoid certain enemies. However, this mark falls under the category of items where it does a thing. If you like that thing, that is fantastic and you should absolutely use it. If you don't like the thing, you may be better served by something else. This is a mark that is highly preferable to some and not preferred by others. And so this is one that could be higher or lower on your personal ranking depending on how much you think you get out. All in all, it is objectively a very solid mark and is worthy of the top 10 spot on this list. Breaking into the top half of B tier, at number 9 is the Knight's Mark. The Knight's Mark has the effect that once charged, used to gain a period of brief invulnerability. This period lasts 7 seconds. It also has a secondary effect that you get +1 to your melee damage while this mark is equipped. Now the Knight's Mark has a very long cooldown compared to some other marks at 24. However, 7 seconds of reactive invincibility makes this one of the best bunker breaker marks in the whole game. In certain areas, you will encounter lots of enemies crowded into one area that is very hard to breach and is very hard to hit with your projectile attack, making it risky to attack them in any sort of shape or form. The Knight's Mark gives you enough of an invulnerability period to where you can go in and tear up their defenses. It's also very helpful for clearing out boss rooms where there's lots of support. Early game, for newer players, this mark is very helpful at clearing out King Slime's army of slimes when he's attacked, or at dealing with the beast's spread blast at the very end of the game. All in all, the Knight's Mark is a very solid mark and retains usefulness throughout the entire game, unlike the next mark that's actually a little higher rated. Rounding off B tier at our number 8 spot is the Innocence Mark. Its effect is that once charged, used to summon a wisp, with a secondary effect adding a heart container. This may be the best new player mark in the entire game. Wisps have 360-degree detection and can help keep players safe from flying enemies like bats. It also has an incredibly low cooldown at 3. The extra heart container is also nice in giving newer players a bit of a buffer in trying to get to the beast for the first time. But that's about where the positives end. Once you get to higher levels of play, again, hearts become less important as taking damage becomes more and more costly until the point where you don't even have hearts, rendering the second effect null and void. And in terms of the wisp effect, you can only have 4 wisps out at one time. So even if you manage to stay far enough away from enemies to not use your wisps, once you hit 4, spawning another one will despawn an old one, meaning you only can get so many wisps at a certain time. This also does not synergize well with any of the relics that allow you to get wisps, as that adds to your 4 maximum wisp count. So keep that in mind if you have lots of relics that summon wisps, but without it, or early game, the Innocence Mark is an excellent option. Starting off A tier at number 7 is the Assassin's Mark. It describes that when charged, used to defeat a random enemy in the room, with a secondary effect adding +1 to ranged weapon damage. Don't be fooled by its description. It does not defeat a random enemy. On the hand where you hold your mark, if you press the activate ability button and point it in a certain direction, it will favor that direction. You can also use it to point at bosses to do a large chunk of damage. Combine this with its low cooldown rate, you have yourself a mark that does wondrous amounts of single target damage to eliminate a problem enemy. The marks above this mark on the list that deal damage simply still do a lot of damage while doing it to multiple enemies at once instead of just one, like the Assassin's mark. At number 6, we have the Berserker's mark, which description says that once charged, used to temporarily increase critical hit chance, with a secondary effect of adding a 5% overall to your crit chance. Even with its high cooldown of 25, the Berserker's mark is the best option for single target damage in the entire game. Using the Berserker's mark to pump up your damage to double on every hit makes it to where bosses' health pools are chewed through very, very quickly. The marks above the Berserker mark on this list simply deal better overall target damage and can still do good damage to bosses if needed in a pinch. Right in the middle of A tier at number 5, we have the Anarchist mark, a far cry from its brother the Anarchist brand, all the way at the bottom in 17. The Anarchist mark has the same effect. When charged, used to cause an explosion. Instead of requiring gold, it requires an 8 enemy kill cooldown and has a secondary effect of a chance to set enemies on fire when striking an enemy. This essentially gives you the Forge Embers relic for free in addition to the mark's effect of doing good overall spread damage. The spread damage of this mark is relatively short ranged, however it does lots of damage on a short cooldown, making it a very good option for experienced and new players alike at all levels of the game. However, there is one other damage mark that does a little bit more than the Anarchist mark, with that mark being our number 4 mark, the Glutton's mark. The Glutton's mark has a description of that when charged, used to deal a small amount of damage to all nearby enemies, with a secondary effect of a plus 10% to evasion. The plus 10% to evasion is a better secondary effect than the Forge Embers effect, and again, don't be misled by the description. The Glutton's mark does a good deal of damage to all nearby enemies. The Glutton's mark in certain setups can actually be used to bypass the entire first phase of the final boss, defeating all of its tendrils in the press of one singular button. It can be used to do good damage to boss enemies, it can be used to do good spread damage to swarm enemies, and is overall the most useful damage mark in the entire game. With a slightly higher cooldown of 16 compared to the Anarchist's 8, it does come at a small cost though, so be sure to use this mark a little more sparingly than the Anarchist comparison. Now with that being said, we're breaking into the top 3 with our number 3 spot being the top part of A tier. The number 3 mark in the game is the Alchemist mark. Its description says that when charged, you can use it to produce a random orb, and the mark has no secondary effect. However, it doesn't really need it. Its primary effect is very, very powerful, and through the orbs, which can give you any range of effects from area damage, to damage buffs, to invincibility, to speed, it's an all-in-one jack-of-all-trades option. The orbs it produces can be stored in inventory slots when food is no longer available, and it can actually mimic lots of the effects of other marks, meaning that late game, when you need certain things, the Alchemist mark can actually adapt when other marks can only do one specific thing. Its versatility and late game use, along with its early game utility, make it the best effect mark in the game. However, the best 2 marks in the game have to do with relic finding. The final 2 marks are in S tier and are so high rated due to their ability to get the player more powerful relics at a much faster rate. And without further ado, let's get into S tier. At our number 2 spot at the bottom of S tier is the Thief's mark. The Thief's mark has the effect that when charged, used to gain a random relic, with the secondary effect of picking up a relic always gives 3 coins. The secondary effect is a nice touch, but in the grand scheme of things is not why you're picking the Thief's mark. The primary effect of gaining a random relic is in a incredibly powerful effect, allowing you to generate powerful relics from literally nothing every 35 kills. The Thief's Mark is one of the best items to have, especially early game when you're trying to build up a relic count to do lots of damage for the late game to overcome those powerful bosses. However, its ability to give you powerful relics is actually not the best. Belonging to our first tier spot is the title holder for best mark in the game belongs to the Magician's Mark. The Magician's Mark has the description of when charged, used to transform nearby upgrade items, with the secondary effect of that dilemmatic pedestals always spawn double items. The Magician's Mark's effect to re-roll relics and guarantee double relic spawns enables experienced players to find better relics. It also helps newer players to find new relics to expand their insight and level their skill tree a little bit faster. The Magician's Mark is the premier mark for late game setups and early game building. Used correctly, its power is far and away better than most of the marks in the game. The Magician Mark's effect actually helps you to replace itself in the end game when relics start to fall off a little and you already have your build. The Magician's Mark is second to none in building the most powerful character in this game for a dungeon delve. And that is my ranking of the 17 marks in Ancient Dungeon VR. So I want to just mention a couple things. First off, I hope you found the list entertaining and helpful for your dungeon delves. And secondly, I want to give a huge thanks to the awesome members of the Ancient Dungeon Discord who helped me come up with this list and the order. So I want to give a big thanks to Grey Acumen, Celeste, and Azure for their help in making this list as sound and as good as I believe it to be. But with that being said, you may not agree with me, and if you do, please let me know what I missed or should have considered in the comments below, and I'll be sure to check down as often as I can. And with that being said, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel.